A being of pure physics falls into a galaxy that runs on faith and fury. The air of Warhammer 40,000 tastes of consecrated iron and the breath of gods that have never stopped being hungry. And into that air comes something the Immaterium has no name for. Rage that does not touch the warp. Strength that owes nothing to prayer or patron or dark covenant. The galaxy has swallowed armies. It has broken champions. It has claimed the willing and the unwilling both. But it has never met a man who carries his own apocalypse inside him and has spent his entire life refusing to let it be taken. In the grim darkness of this far future, even patience has its limits. Does the man who cannot be destroyed survive a universe that has never stopped trying? The coolant lines of Solex Primaris had run without interruption for 8 centuries. This was not a matter of pride. Pride was a human indulgence that the Adeptus Mechanicus tolerated in others the way they tolerated most biological inefficiencies, with patience and the quiet confidence that eventually the machine would outlast the sentiment. The coolant lines ran without interruption because they had been engineered to run without interruption, calibrated by successive generations of magi who treated the preservation of flow rates as a form of worship, which in the Mechanicus was not a metaphor. The Omnissiah's will was expressed in continuous industrial function. The forge world of Solex Primaris was a prayer made of iron and heat, and the endless cycling of mineral ore into refined metal that kept the warships of the Segmentum Tempestus armored. Its hive stacks rose 2 kilometers from a surface that had not seen unfiltered sunlight since the 3rd century of imperial settlement. Its chimneys processed atmosphere at a rate that turned the sky the color of an old bruise and kept it that color permanently. Its streets, where streets existed at all, were ferrocrete channels between walls of machinery that hummed with the continuous devotion of 10 million moving parts. It was not a beautiful world. It was not meant to be beautiful. It was meant to function, and for 8 centuries, minus a few isolated periods of war and mechanical failure that the Mechanicus had resolved and archived, it had functioned. Magos Tertiary Olven Drax Sabel had served this function for 61 years. She was 3/4 augmented at this point, both arms replaced at the shoulder with mechadendrite clusters and multi-tool arrays, one eye replaced with a photoreceptor unit that could read spectral frequencies human vision never accessed, her lower thoracic cavity given over to a secondary cogitator system that ran background processing, while her primary consciousness handled the foreground work of keeping 8,000 machines running simultaneously. She did not sleep. She achieved periodic low processing states, during which her mechadendrites performed maintenance on each other. She experienced something that might, in biological terms, have been called satisfaction when the numbers aligned. In 61 years of service, they had always aligned. Eventually, on the 412th anniversary of the coolant line's uninterrupted operation, every seismic sensor in the southern refinery district went critical at once. She was recalibrating a manifold coupling in sublevel 17 when the alerts hit. Not a cascade failure, not a pressure event, not a tremor from the deep-bore mining that sometimes sent vibrations through the planet's crust in patterns the older magi called the world's complaints. This was impact. A single point, Sector Gamma 9, Southern Processing Zone, 3 kilometers from her current position. The force calculation was consistent with a siege shell. But no orbital picket had flagged an inbound trajectory, no launch signature, no warp translation event of any classification, no slipspace echo, nothing. The thing had simply appeared, and the force of its appearance had registered on sensors calibrated to detect events 14 orders of magnitude smaller. She ran the numbers for 19 seconds. They did not explain themselves. Then the radiation counters began climbing, and the frequency of what they were recording was something she had never catalogued in 61 years of spectral analysis. Not Psyker event, not warp translation echo, not plasma bloom, not electromagnetic discharge in any configuration her database covered. Something adjacent to electromagnetic discharge but not electromagnetic. Something that, if she allowed herself the biochemically dubious indulgence of metaphor, smelled of deep-buried stone and old lightning, and something alive that should not, by any available physical logic, have been as large as it was. She dispatched a Skitarii Ranger team within 4 minutes, which was exceptional response time given that she was 3 kilometers from the impact site and had to reroute the team through 2 active processing corridors. Standard protocol: observe, record, do not engage until classification was established. She began composing an emergency astropathic notification to the nearest inquisitorial contact she carried in active memory before the Ranger team had even reached the impact zone, because 61 years of service had refined her threat assessment into something that operated partly on instinct, and her instinct was saying that whatever had arrived on Solex Primaris was not a problem she should attempt to solve alone or quickly. On the surface of Sector Gamma 9, the dome that had processed refined adamantium ore since the founding of the forged city of Velharix had ceased to exist. It had not exploded, it had not imploded. It had shattered from the inside in a single percussive detonation that launched plates of ferrocrete and stamped iron, some the size of Hab block walls, across 400 meters in every direction. 3 servitor hauler units operating within 100 meters of the dome had ceased function simultaneously, their biological components and their mechanical ones equally disrupted by a radiation pulse that would require 6 months of analysis to partially characterize. The ground for 200 meters around the impact point was cracked in concentric rings, the ferrocrete fractured, as if something of enormous mass had arrived traveling very fast, and then stopped very suddenly, which was, in the most technically accurate sense available, exactly what had happened. What stood in the crater where the dome had been was 12 feet of green muscle and barely contained force, breathing sulfur-thick air with lungs that processed it as efficiently as a bellows processes coal. Bruce Banner did not know where he was. He knew what had happened in the way that a man who has been swallowed by the wrong thing many times knows what has happened. Something had reached through the quantum field during a gamma pulse and pulled. The last sensory data from his previous location was a New Mexico laboratory, a containment device running calculations that had been flagged as theoretically impossible, and then the smell of ozone, and his own voice saying that the containment was intact, and then the containment had not been intact, because the containment was always him, and he had been the thing that crossed. The transition back to Banner had not yet happened. The Hulk stood in the crater and took in the world that had received him, the brown-gray sky, the industrial chimneys that rose into clouds, made of manufacturing rather than weather, the vast Baroque ironwork of buildings built by and for a civilization that had decided scale was the appropriate expression of devotion. Nothing moved except smoke and the slow drift of industrial particulate through air that tasted of rust and consecrated oil. The Hulk's threat assessment was fast and absolute. New place, unknown variables. Wait. He did not wait long. They came from the north, a mob of something his eyes passed as wrong, before the borrowed intelligence of his host's mind caught up. Too large for men. The smallest of them stood nearly 7 feet and was built like something carved from stone and given the idea of motion as an afterthought. They were armored in iron plates welded directly to their bodies with disregard for the comfort of the process, and they carried weapons that were more conceptually weapon-shaped than specifically functional. A blade that was also a piece of salvaged machinery, a gun that was primarily an expression of desire for something nearby to explode, a club that had been a vehicle part improved by the addition of more spikes. At their head, the thing that made the rest look modest, 9 feet of warlord. Broader across the chest than a Space Marine dreadnought. Power armor assembled from a dozen sources over what appeared to be centuries, each piece welded and bolted, and in several places simply tied to the pieces adjacent to it. One tusk broken and grown back in a different direction. The other filed to a point and capped in brass. In his right hand a power claw that hummed with barely restrained energy. In his left, swinging loosely, a weapon that had once been a vehicle door, improved by the addition of metal teeth along its leading edge. War boss Urgrak Bonebreaker had been stripping the outer refineries of Solex Primaris for 22 days. He had killed 43 things in those 22 days, which was a respectable tally, but not the kind of tally that made a warlord of his standing feel that a campaign had earned a name. He had been considering moving the warband. A different sector, more resistance. Possibly some of those cogitator spirits that seem to explode satisfyingly when you hit the right part. He stopped at the crater rim. He looked down. The green thing in the crater looked up. Urgrak had spent his entire existence looking for things that were worth fighting. He had fought Astartes and Tau and Necrons that would not stop moving even after they should have stopped, and, once, memorably, a Carnifex whose personal qualities he still described in detail to anyone who would listen. He had a sense, developed through approximately 200 years of combat, for the specific quality of a being that was going to be a fight rather than a conclusion. This was a fight, he laughed, genuinely, with his whole chest, with the uncomplicated joy of a being who has found exactly what he was looking for in the last place he expected to find it. His boys, ranked behind him at the crater rim, registered the laugh and understood its implications and began making noises of collective anticipation. "Dat," Urgrak announced to the sky and the smoke and the ruined dome and everything that could hear him, "is a fight." He jumped into the crater. The Hulk hit him before he landed. A chunk of ferrocrete, the mass of a ground car, caught from the rubble at his feet and launched in the single motion that was not throwing and not striking, but something between the two, something that required no calculation, because the Hulk did not calculate these things. He simply knew them. The chunk connected with Urgrak's chest in mid-descent and drove him back through the air, and Urgrak caught the crater rim with his power claw on the return and arrested his flight with a screech of metal on stone that carved a 3-meter scar in the ferrocrete. He looked at the Hulk. He looked at the ferrocrete chunk, which had shattered into fragments that were themselves the size of things he had previously considered impressive projectiles. He grinned with every tooth he had. "Good start," he said. What followed occupied 12 minutes on a Forge world that had not previously hosted this category of violence and would spend the next 6 months filing incident reports that did not have adequate terminology for it. The Hulk went at Urgrak with the directness of something that had never needed strategy, because strategy was what you required when you had limits, and the Hulk's limits had never been meaningfully found by anything he had encountered before. Urgrak received this with the professional appreciation of a connoisseur, absorbing, redirecting, returning with force that made the Hulk's feet slide in the rubble. The power claw was the first revelation. It carved a furrow across the Hulk's left arm in a move that would have removed a Space Marine's limb at the shoulder, and the furrow sealed in 8 seconds. But in the intervening 8 seconds, the Hulk had experienced something he experienced very rarely: registered damage, real damage, the kind that reached past the physiology and touched the thing underneath it. His response was proportionate to what that meant. He hit Urgrak with both fists driving downward simultaneously. A hammer blow that collapsed the claw's first hydraulic joint and sent the warlord through the crater's southern wall and into the adjacent processing tunnel. And the sound of it was the sound of two very large things disagreeing about the local geography. Urgrak came out of the processing tunnel trailing lubricant fluid and dragging the vehicle door weapon, which he had lost his grip on in the impact and now retrieved without slowing. The door's teeth had been damaged in the tunnel collapse. He examined this for half a second with the focused attention of a craftsman inspecting his tools, then used it anyway, slamming it across the Hulk's collarbone in a swing that traveled 6 feet of arc and carried everything Urgrak's physiology could produce. The Hulk staggered. His feet left the ground. He landed 12 meters back in the rubble of the dome's perimeter wall, and the rubble relocated significantly to accommodate him. He got up, faster than something that had just moved 12 meters through the air should have gotten up. He was getting angrier. This was not a problem to the Hulk. This was a solution. His strength was a direct expression of his anger. His anger was generated by resistance, and Urgrak Bonebreaker was the purest expression of resistance he had encountered in recent memory. Not tactical resistance, not principled resistance, not the desperate resistance of something fighting for survival, but gladiatorial resistance, the resistance of a being that wanted nothing from this encounter except the encounter itself. Every blow that connected drove the anger higher. Every time Urgrak absorbed something that should have ended him and came back with that expression of absolute gladiatorial satisfaction, the anger climbed further. The boys at the crater rim went completely silent. 200 orcs, not breathing, not moving, not making any of the sounds that orcs in proximity to each other inevitably made, watching. The Wa energy that bound them as a collective had oriented, focused, was pointed at the crater like a lens pointing at a flame. 3 more exchanges. The dome's remaining debris reduced to fragments. The original crater deepened by 4 meters. 2 adjacent processing tunnels whose structural ceilings had been compromised by the initial impact now fully collapsed. The Hulk's right shoulder, which had stopped a power claw strike aimed at his neck, was healing through bruising deep enough to have fractured ceramite plate. Urgrak was missing his tusk cap on the right side, had lost 3 fingers on his left hand to an impact that he seemed to have noticed only in retrospect, and his armor's primary power relay was sparking from a junction that had taken a direct strike and was reconsidering its participation in the ongoing events. The warlord ended up at the bottom of a secondary crater, both arms still attached but functioning at roughly 60% each, the vehicle door weapon broken in 2 pieces somewhere behind him. His left pauldron caved inward at an angle that would require a very large mallet to address. He looked up at the Hulk standing over him, and his face was doing something that Banner, watching from inside the rage, had never seen on any hostile thing he had shared the Hulk's experience with. It was peace, not defeat, not surrender, not the particular expression of something that has stopped fighting because it cannot continue. The opposite, the face of a man who has gotten precisely and completely what he wanted. "You're the best fight," Urgrak said, without preamble and without performance, "in 1,000 years. And I've been avin fights for dat long." The Hulk stared at him. The anger had nowhere to go. When the anger had nowhere to go, it did not build, it sat. And when the anger sat, Banner surfaced like a diver gasping for air at the top of a very long ascent. The transformation was what it always was, unpleasant, non-negotiable, over in seconds. 200 orcs at the crater rim watched with the focused intensity of beings who had never seen anything like it, and were, in the collective psychic sense, recording it as something that would be discussed for a long time. A man where the mountain had been, dark-haired, dark-eyed, wearing the remnants of clothing that had survived the transformation, because the gamma-resistant weave Banner had commissioned from a materials lab in Cambridge 2 years ago was the single best investment he had ever made. He sat down on the rubble because his legs were making the suggestion, and breathed with the controlled discipline of someone who knew that the first 90 seconds after a transition were when control was most fragile. Urgrak sat up, cracked his knuckles one by one, considered the man across the crater with the direct assessment of a being who had spent 2 centuries sorting the world into things worth attention and things not worth attention, and had gotten very good at the sorting. "Where'd the green one go? He's still here." Banner had said this too many times to count, and said it the same way every time. Not defensive, not apologetic, accurate. "We're the same person." Urgrak absorbed this with the focused consideration of a war boss examining a new tactical situation. "Both in Derry at once." "Yes." "Which one's in charge?" Banner looked at his hands. "That depends on the circumstances." Urgrak nodded, as if this were a perfectly sensible system of governance. He reached into his armor and produced a piece of dried meat of uncertain provenance and began eating it. Around the crater rim, his knobs arranged themselves in a rough circle that was simultaneously honor guard and audience, with a solemnity that was unusual in beings whose default operating mode was near frenzy. "You're new," Urgrak said. "Very. Where you from?" "Somewhere very far away. A different universe, I think." Urgrak considered this. "Do you anything good to fight deer?" The pause that followed contained several things that Banner had no intention of explaining in any detail. "Yes," he said. Urgrak looked satisfied. He said nothing else. He ate his dried meat and looked at the sky. Banner sat on the rubble and breathed carefully, and did not yet understand what was happening in the background of the world around him, in the frequency that bound the orcs of this region into a single collective force. In that frequency, the Wa was already responding to what it had just felt. The Warg energy of an orc population was not, in Mechanicus classification terms, a metaphysical phenomenon in the mystical sense. It was a measurable, quantifiable psychic field, generated by the collective battle excitement of orc minds, and capable of affecting both the physical world and the warp in ways that 8,000 years of imperial science had studied without fully explaining. Large wars affected local warp travel. Exceptional wars altered weather and induced technological malfunctions in enemy equipment. The field was real, it was present, and it was oriented, always, toward the largest and most interesting source of conflict available. The Hulk had just provided the largest and most interesting source of conflict available. The gamma radiation signature of Bruce Banner's body, even in human form, was continuous and low-level, a permanent emission at a frequency that had no designation in the Mechanicus spectral catalog because it had never been encountered before. At the cellular level, in the quantum substrate of the mutation that had rewritten his physiology, the emission was the hum of a system perpetually wound. These two fields, the Warg and the Gamma, met in the hours after the fight in the crater. They were not identical, they were not complementary in any engineered sense, but they were resonant in the way that two differently tuned strings produce a third tone when struck in proximity. Something between them that was neither. The War field registered the gamma emission as a new note in its frequency and oriented toward it the way orcs oriented toward anything that smelled of a good fight. The gamma field did not orient consciously, but at the cellular level it registered the resonance, and the registration was not neutral. Banner did not know this, not yet. He spent the remainder of the first day in the Warg's periphery, tolerated by Urgrak's warband in the specific way that extraordinary things are tolerated by orcs. You did not attack the extraordinary thing unless the extraordinary thing gave you a reason, because the extraordinary thing might be useful, or might be a sign, or might simply be worth having nearby, on the theory that extraordinary things attracted other extraordinary things. He scavenged through the rubble of the dome's aftermath and found cogitator components and wire and sensor elements, because building things was what he did when he was trying to understand a situation and the available instruments were inadequate. He transformed twice more before the first day ended. The first time was deliberate and forced, a confrontation with a Mechanicus Castellan-class robot that Olven had deployed in a desperate moment of tactical optimism, having classified Banner as a xenobiological aggressor of significant combat capability, and sent the Castellan to contain him before better options were available. The Castellan lost both arms and its optical array. The second time was at night, which Banner had not done in 4 years, a transition he had not initiated and could not fully explain, leaving him standing in the wreckage of a cooling tower at 2 in the morning, in a form he had not called and could not initially dismiss. He held the night transition for 11 minutes before the Hulk's anger found no purchase and released. He noticed the difference. The return had taken 11 minutes where 6 months ago it would have taken 4. The anger was at a higher baseline temperature than he remembered. He sat in the rubble of the cooling tower and ran the numbers of his own physiology with the methodical attention of a man who had been managing his own internal climate for 2 decades and knew its weather patterns intimately. Something was off. Something was being changed from the outside. He built the radiation monitor faster after that. He completed it on the morning of the second day, a device that had no right to work given the components it was built from, and which worked because Banner had a quality that the Mechanicus would have classified as gift of the Omnissiah, and that Banner himself would have classified as 30 years of practice. The monitor showed him his own gamma signature, the Warg field layered beneath it, the resonance between them, and it showed him a third signal, faint, directional, coming from somewhere that was not quite any physical location in the environment around him, intelligent, watching, getting stronger each day. He told no one. He had not yet found anyone on this world he trusted enough. On the morning of the third day, he found Urgrak sitting outside what had been the Warg's secondary staging area, performing maintenance on his power claw, with a set of tools that were enormous and somehow precise. The war boss had not sought him out, had not avoided him, had simply been present in his general vicinity with the particular quality of an entity that had made a decision and was living inside it without announcing it. Banner sat near him. "You've been watching me," Banner said. "Yep. What have you decided?" Urgrak looked up from the claw. "You ain't prey. You ain't an ally exactly. You're something worth keeping around to see what happens. In your terms, Banner said, is that a good thing? It's the best thing, Urgrak said, with complete sincerity, and went back to the claw. Inquisitor Meredith Hahn arrived in the Solex system on the morning of the 4th day. She had been in transit since Ulven's astropathic notification reached her. 3 days of hard burn on a light cruiser, running no identifiers, pushing its engines to limits the ship's Enginseer had accepted because Hahn had phrased the order in terms that made refusal a more complicated proposition than compliance. She had spent the transit reading every available file in her personal inquisitorial database on dimensional incursions, gamma-irradiated entities, and anomalous psychic field interactions, and had arrived at a picture that was incomplete in the specific ways that incomplete pictures are most dangerous. It told her what the situation was, but not yet what it was becoming. She also carried, filed in her personal classification system under a label that would mean nothing to anyone who found it without context, 6 fragmentary records from prior inquisitorial operations in sectors adjacent to dimensional anomalies. The records described, in terms that ranged from clinical to barely coherent, encounters with beings of gamma-generated power. The records did not agree on the specifics. They agreed on 2 things. The beings were extraordinarily dangerous, and the beings, without exception, had not wanted to be in the situations they found themselves in. That last detail was, in Hahn's 3 decades of experience, significant. Her retinue for this operation was compact by design. Vesper, her interrogator, 3 years into the role and already better at the work than most Inquisitors Hahn had met in full exercise of their authority. 2 Crusaders, Kale and San, 11 years of service each, their primary virtue being that they did not ask questions the mission had not made necessary. Brother Aldrich of the Storm Wardens chapter, on Deathwatch secondment from Watch Fortress Eriok, whose psychic gift manifested as a reliable and precise sense of warp presences in the local ether, a gift Hahn valued above most of his considerable other abilities, and Thresh, who had no official role in any organizational chart, and whose specific skills were classified above Hahn's own security clearance, which was a situation she had accepted 11 years ago, on the understanding that Thresh's usefulness exceeded her opacity. She reviewed Ulven's latest sensor data on the descent. 19 Orc warbands converging on a single point on a Forge world. The convergence had no tactical explanation, derivable from standard Orc behavioral analysis. The Orcs were not following a resource concentration, not trailing a successful raider, not exhibiting the herd-following behavior that sometimes accompanied a war boss reaching critical mass of personal reputation. They were following something else, something that resonated in the Warg field at a frequency that Ulven's instruments had no adequate designation for, the gamma signal. Hahn had the hypothesis before she landed. She needed a conversation to confirm it. She found Banner in what had been the War's eastern staging area, now a neutral zone in the loose geography of the Orc occupation. He was sitting against a ferrocrete pillar, working on the radiation monitor with the careful focus of someone still calibrating, rather than finished building. He did not look up when she entered with her retinue. She studied him for 30 seconds before speaking. What she observed, a man in his late 30s by biological appearance, probably older by actual count, unremarkable physical presence that was nonetheless somehow not unremarkable, the specific quality of someone who had learned to occupy less space than they actually required, hands that were precise in their work, attention divided, with roughly 40% monitoring the room and the door and the quality of air without interrupting the hands. Not paranoia, calibration, a man who had been in a great many situations that required knowing where the exits were. "You're building something," she said. He looked up and assessed her in less time than she had taken with him, and she noted that he did not look at the Crusaders, he looked at her. "Radiation monitor, the baseline here is wrong. There's a frequency I've never encountered that isn't coming from me. I want to know what it is." "Wah energy," Hahn said. "Collective psychic battle focus of Orc populations. A measurable warp resonance field capable of affecting the material world. It is why there are 19 warbands converging on this forge world from across the continent. He set down the monitor. Something in his expression shifted, fast, the specific expression of a scientist confirming a hypothesis he had hoped was wrong. The anger field, he said quietly. She noted the designation. The accuracy of it, from someone who had encountered the field for 3 days without any prior briefing, told her something precise about his mind. If you want to call it that. And it's resonating with the gamma, that's why the transitions are harder. That is my working hypothesis. The resonance between the Warg field and your body's baseline gamma emission is creating a feedback dynamic. The Hulk's output increases the Warg field's energy. The increased Warg field raises the gamma baseline, which in turn raises the floor from which the next transition begins. And you need me to leave, he said, cutting directly to it. The Warg shrinks without you. Within a week of your departure, the convergence reverses. Within 2 weeks, the threat to this forge world is manageable by standard Imperial response. She sat across from him on a crate, without being invited. Is there a way back? He was quiet for a moment in the way of real calculation. The event that brought me here was a quantum field pulse during a gamma interaction. The pulse created a dimensional aperture. In theory, replicating the conditions could create a return pathway. What does replication require? The Hulk, at significantly elevated output, well above standard operating levels. He paused. But the longer the Hulk operates in this place with the Warg field active, the harder the return transition becomes. The feedback dynamic runs the other way too. It is not just making him stronger, it is making the separation between us harder to bridge. Han held his eyes and said the thing that needed to be said clearly. So to leave, you must become the thing that, the longer it exists in this environment, makes you less able to return to yourself. Yes. How long a window do you have at peak output before the feedback becomes insurmountable? Approximately 90 seconds. He held her gaze. There is something else. I know, she said, the third signal. He was very still for exactly 1 second. You've detected it. My psychic asset detected a warp presence in the local aether on arrival. Intelligent, directional, interested specifically in you. She paused. In my experience, things of this category that watch patiently and do not act immediately are worse than things that attack at once. How much worse? The being I believe is watching has been serving its patron for 800 years, has the patience of something that has never encountered a timeline it could not eventually reshape, and is interested in you specifically because you represent something it has no existing category for. She let that land. In the terms of this universe, a being of physics-generated rage that carries no warp signature is categorically unprecedented. The architect of fate, which is one of the ruinous powers that govern the chaos dimension of this galaxy, collects unprecedented things, not always by force, mostly by adjustment. Small adjustments to existing conditions, accumulated over time, until the target becomes what it was always going to become from the moment the architect noticed it. Banner was quiet for a long moment. Outside the building, the sound of orcs in their natural state, movement, argument, the occasional percussive dispute. It's been building a bridge, he said. Yes, the resonance, the harder transitions. It's been adjusting the frequency between the Warg and the gamma. He closed his eyes for 1 second, doing something internal and rapid and precise. How long do we have before it acts? My assessment is that it is waiting for the aperture attempt. The conditions it needs to complete the alignment are the same conditions we need to open the exit. She stood. Which means we build the apparatus as fast as possible and we run it before it can finish. How fast? 3 days. If the Mechanicus here works without interruption. He looked at her for a long moment. The specific expression of a man taking measure of someone he has no reason to trust and has no better option than to. Tell me what you need me to do, she told him. Zerath the Unwritten had been watching from the warp since the moment the gamma pulse registered in the aether. He was not old by the standards of Chazincha's hierarchy. 800 years of post-mortal existence placed him in the middle stratum, senior enough to operate independently in the material world, junior enough that he was still accumulating the understanding that elevated true sorcerers from capable functionaries to irreplaceable assets. In 800 years, he had developed a specific excellence that his contemporaries lacked: the ability to treat every observation as data, every interaction as material for revision, every failed branch as the correction that the next attempt required. He had theories about gamma radiation that predated the event on Solex Primaris by 60 years. The theories had begun with a corrupted Mechanicus Archaeotech vault, accessed through a servitor host he had hollowed and repurposed for precisely this kind of deep archive work. The vault had contained among its 17,000 files a fragmentary record of something called cross-dimensional resonance events, documented in a format so degraded that even his considerable gifts of linguistic reconstruction had yielded only partial recovery. The partial recovery had been enough, a form of energy that existed in the material universe at a frequency adjacent to the warp, but not of it. Not psychic in origin, not warp adjacent in any conventional sense, something from a layer of physical reality that predated the warp's current dominant structure, older than the gods, older than the Eldar civilization that had inadvertently created them, something that belonged to a universe that had solved its deepest problems differently. In 60 years of searching, he had found no example of such energy in the current galaxy. Then a gamma pulse had cracked the wall between universes, and the being that carried the energy he had theorized about had walked through the crack and onto a forge world in the Segmentum Tempestus, and Zerath had been in position in the warp within 14 seconds of the pulse registering in the ether, which was record time even for him. He watched for 3 days without acting. This was not hesitation. It was the architect's method, internalized so completely that Zerath no longer experienced it as discipline. Observe until the shape of the event becomes visible, then identify which branch leads to the most interesting destination, then act with minimum required intervention to place the event on that branch. The interesting destination here was not capture, it was not destruction, it was transformation. The gamma being carried energy that existed adjacent to the warp without touching it. If Zerath could align that energy with the warp's frequency, he would create something categorically new. Not a daemon, not a champion, a being of physics-generated rage finally resonant with the immaterium, something that had no precedent in 40,000 years of recorded history. New things interested the architect more than any other offering. He began the adjustment on the first night. A fractional shift in the Warg field frequency, calibrated to the gamma emission's specific signature, imperceptible even to Orc psychic awareness because it operated at a precision level below what any Orc mind could distinguish. The Orcs did not notice because Orcs were not built for subtlety, and what Zerath was doing was subtlety refined to its most essential expression. Each day, a small tightening, the resonance drawing closer, the feedback dynamic amplifying with each Hulk transition, each transition making the next one harder to reverse, each harder reversal advancing the bridge's construction by a measurable increment. On the 4th day, he felt the Inquisitor arrive, and he moved his timeline forward, not dramatically. The bridge was 90% complete, which meant it required one focused push from the warp at maximum gamma output to close. He needed the Hulk at full output. He needed Banner angry enough, driven enough, sustained enough, at peak emission, to provide the closing energy. He needed, in other words, exactly what Banner and the Inquisitor were building toward. This was the thing about the architect's gifts. Every solution to the problem became part of the problem's resolution. Construction of the aperture apparatus took 3 days. Olven had the processing center's main floor cleared in 4 hours. The existing cogitator arrays slaved to the new configuration by noon of the first day. The Mechanicus forces on Solex Primaris were not substantial. The Forge world operating at reduced staffing during the ongoing subsector military commitments that had been drawing personnel for 18 months. But what Olven had was skilled, and what she had in addition to skilled was Banner, which she had not expected and addressed initially, with the wariness of a Magos confronted with a non-Mechanicus claiming competence in advanced technical operations. The wariness lasted approximately 6 hours. Banner's understanding of quantum resonance focusing exceeded her own in the specific and crucial domain they were working in, and Olven was a pragmatist above all else. She accommodated expertise wherever she found it. By the end of the first day, they were collaborating with the specific efficiency of two people who shared a goal, if not a framework, communicating in the shorthand of numbers and configuration parameters that engineers developed when they understood the same problem deeply enough to stop explaining themselves. Han coordinated the security perimeter. The orcs remained a persistent concern, not because Urgrak showed inclination toward disruption, but because the 19 converging warbands included several whose leaders had not reached Urgrak's assessment of the green monster's status. 3 significant engagements in the outer processing district over 3 days, handled by Skitari Rangers in combination with Kale and Sane, and once, at the northeast gate, by Thresh, in a manner that the Ranger Sergeant's subsequent report described as efficient but difficult to classify under standard engagement protocols. Brother Aldrich monitored the warp presence. On the second day, he told Han that it was moving, closer, still in the warp, but barely. On the third day, he told her it was waiting for something specific. She told him she knew what it was waiting for. She told him what she needed from him. He was quiet for a moment, with the honesty of a man taking precise measure of his own capacity against an unknown scale of threat. "I can introduce noise into its working frequency," he said. "I cannot stop it directly. My gift is perception and interference, not combat psychic engagement against something of this age and power." "I need 25 additional seconds," Han said. "That is what I need from you." He said nothing for a long moment. Then, "I will try to give you 30. She went to find Banner. He was at the monitoring station, looking at the third signal's display with the expression she had learned to read in 3 days. Not afraid, specifically and precisely angry. The anger of a man who has spent his entire life trying to solve the problem of himself and has developed, through decades of trying, a fierce intolerance for external forces that see the problem as an opportunity. "It's waiting for us to run the aperture sequence," he said. "Yes. So we have 90 seconds after I hit full output to get through before it completes the alignment. And if the alignment completes before I get through, the Hulk becomes whatever it wants him to become. That is the situation." He turned to look at her. The look of a man taking one final measure of a person he has not had time to trust properly, but is choosing to trust anyway, because the math leaves no alternative. "Can your people buy me 90 seconds? "Yes," she said, without qualification. She believed it, because she had decided to believe it, and she had learned, in 30 years, that some decisions were made correctly by choosing the required outcome and finding the way to it. He nodded once. He did not ask if she was sure. He went to find Urgrak. The war boss was at the outer perimeter watching 2 of his nobs argue with the focused attention of a man who found all conflict interesting regardless of scale. He dismissed the nobs when Banner approached, and the nobs took themselves away with the energy of beings interrupted at a promising moment. Urgrak looked at the small man who contained the best fight he had found in 1,000 years and said nothing. Banner stood across from him and said nothing for a moment. "Tomorrow," Banner said, "we try the exit." Urgrak's face did the assessment thing. "You gonna fight to get it open?" "Yes." "The green one?" "Yes." "And Fingin the warp's gonna try to stop you." Banner paused. He had been briefly surprised that Urgrak knew, then remembered that the Warg was itself a warp phenomenon, and that an orc war boss of Urgrak's age had been living in a psychic environment that registered unusual warp activity as naturally as weather. "Yes, knew about it for 2 days, Urgrak said, with no particular emphasis. "Didn't say nothin', because you were still working it out. Didn't want to rush you." Banner was quiet for a moment. "When it comes through tomorrow, if it gets past the Inquisitor, I need it to be a fight, something physical and immediate that the Hulk can respond to. If it makes it a ritual, a binding, something that operates on a frequency the Hulk can't hit, I lose." Urgrak looked at him. "You want me to make it a fight?" "Yes." The war boss was quiet for a long time with the specific quality of someone sitting with something he already knew the answer to. "Yeah," he said finally, "I can do that." They did not say anything else. Banner walked back toward the processing center. Urgrak watched him go with an expression that was not sentiment exactly, but was in the same territory that sentiment occupied in beings built differently from the ones sentiment was designed for. The Aperture event was scheduled for before the dawn shift. The processing center had been reduced to its load-bearing structure on the ground floor, every salvageable cogitator and power relay incorporated into an emitter array that filled the center of the space in a configuration that Olven called improvised, in the tone of someone for whom improvised meant built to the limits of available resources rather than the limits of optimal design. She had not slept. She had not achieved her low processing state. She had calibrated every component in the array 3 times and was beginning a 4th pass when Banner arrived and told her to stop, that the 4th pass was not improving anything, and that the array was as accurate as it was going to be. She stopped. She respected accuracy as an argument. Everyone was in position before the light changed. Han stood to the right of the array with Vesper and both Crusaders in a line that communicated, by position rather than formation, that they were here to protect and not to interfere. Thresh was in the upper infrastructure, which was where Thresh was during any operation that might require something resolved at distance without discussion. Aldrich stood near the aperture-facing side of the array, with his eyes closed and his hands at his sides, doing something quiet and internal that Han trusted without fully understanding. Urgrak stood against the north wall with 4 knobs, the stillness of a war boss who has made an agreement and intends to honor it. Banner stood in the center of the emitter array. He was wearing the same work clothes he had been wearing for 3 days, which was appropriate because they were not going to survive the next 90 seconds in any case. He looked at the marks on the floor. He looked at the array surrounding him. He looked at Olven, who was at her cogitator station with her hands already over the initiation sequence and her photoreceptor eye making micro-corrections to the calibration that had not needed making 3 minutes ago and did not need making now, which meant she was doing what all engineers did in the last moments before something irreversible, touching the controls one more time to confirm they existed. He looked at Urgrak. The war boss met his eyes across the space. Something passed between them that was not words and was not quite feeling, but existed in the specific register of 2 beings who have tested each other honestly and found in each other the rarest available thing, a worthy measure. "Ready?" Olvene asked. Banner took 1 breath in, 1 breath out. "No," he said. Then, "Yes, run it." The emitters came online in the sequence Olven had choreographed over 3 days of calculation. The gamma-focusing arrays powered up one by one, surrounding Banner in a cage of directed radiation that his body was already recognizing before the first emitter reached full power, the cellular interaction beginning at the edges of his physiology and moving inward with the inexorable pace of a process that had happened too many times to be unfamiliar, even when it remained unwelcome. He changed. The Hulk was not fully assembled before the room understood what was happening to it. He grew into the space too fast for the architecture to adjust, 12 feet of green muscle and barely contained force, the ceiling 3 feet above his head, the emitter array's outer ring at shoulder height, the gamma output spiking on Olven's sensors in a curve that bent toward vertical before she had compensated for the first third of the climb. Her hands flew across the controls, redistributing monitoring load, compensating for the surge, keeping the focusing arrays aligned on a subject that was larger than the array had been designed for. In the warp, 3 kilometers from Solex Primaris's upper atmosphere, Zerath the Unwritten felt the gamma pulse and came. He arrived sideways, the way things of his nature arrived. No dramatic tearing of sky, no collapse of reality's surface, simply a fold opening in the northeast corner of the processing center between one instant and the next. He stepped through in the form he had chosen, the sorcerer he had been in life. 800 years, refined and compressed into a body that wore the appearance of humanity, the way a ceremonial mask wore the appearance of a face. Robes the color of change, shifting as the eye moved across them, a staff that bent light around itself by existing in multiple probability states simultaneously. Eyes that were not exactly eyes but points of focused attention, in a face that was more arrangement than anatomy. He found the Hulk immediately. He looked at the Hulk with something that would have been admiration in a human face and was its functional equivalent in his. "How industrious," he said. The voice arrived in the center of the skull without passing through the ear. "You have built an exit. I would have helped had you asked." The Hulk did not deliberate. The blow traveled 11 feet and carried the aggregate output of a gamma-powered physiology at approaching peak emission, and it would have destroyed a Chaos Space Marine entirely. Zerath folded around it with the ease of something that had not inhabited only one location at a time in several centuries, the reality where his form had been briefly ceased to contain him. The Hulk's fist impacted empty air and went through the processing center's outer wall, and Zerath was standing 2 meters to the left, looking at the Hulk with an expression that made the admiration explicit. "Yes," he said, "that is what I came for." "What do you want?" Han's voice, flat, not a question. "What I have always wanted." The staff turned in his hands, slowly, the way a man turns a problem to examine its other faces. Change. Specifically, the most interesting change available. The being you call the Hulk generates energy that exists adjacent to the warp without originating from it. In the history of this age of the universe, that is unique. I intend to align that energy with the immaterium, not to consume it, not to claim it for any patron, to create something that has no existing category. He will not become your instrument. He would become something beyond instrument, something unprecedented. His attention moved entirely to the Hulk. "The bridge has been building for 4 days. 3 days of WAG resonance and 1 day of my direct adjustment. It lacks 30 seconds of full gamma output to close, which you are providing for me, with admirable efficiency." 35 seconds, Olven said from her station. "Aperture formation in 55. Then we are racing," Zerath said, and raised his staff and pushed. The force of his will did not move through the air. It moved through the gamma field itself, through the resonance he had spent 4 days building, through the bridge that now existed between Banner's physics and the warp's metaphysics, and it hit the Hulk at the precise frequency where those two things had been introduced to each other and begun to become familiar. The Hulk made a sound that was not a roar, older than a roar, the sound of a thing discovering that someone has reached inside the place it lives and touched the walls of it. Inside that sound, Banner held on. He had been holding on for 23 years, not to control, not to suppress, to stay present. To be the will that the Hulk was the expression of, to remain in relationship with the thing he was, rather than lost to it. Most of the time this looked like failure, transformation he had not chosen, damage he had not meant, cities more rubble than before. But presence was not the same as control. Presence was being in the same place as the thing you were, looking at it clearly, not pretending it was separate from you or that you were separate from it. Zerath was reaching through the gamma field, through the rage, through the quantum-level mutation that had rewritten Banner at the deepest available level. He was reaching for the power. He found the power, enormous and genuine and functionally limitless. He was pushing through it toward the alignment that would make it warp-resonant, make it permanent, make it his category-breaking achievement. He had not found Banner, not because Banner was hidden, because Banner was the Hulk, not merged, not unified in any philosophical sense, but the same thing expressed in 2 registers. And the sorcerer was reaching for something that had no seam to grip. He was trying to separate the expression from the will, and the expression and the will were the same substance. The Hulk's output spiked. Olven redlined 12 sensors and pulled them offline. Aperture in 35 seconds. Aldrich stepped forward with his eyes still closed and his hands extended slightly from his sides. He was not fighting the warp presence. He was introducing noise into the frequency Zerath was using, degrading the precision of the alignment attempt, forcing the sorcerer to spend additional energy, compensating for interference that should not have been there. Not enough to stop, enough to slow, Zerath noticed. He pushed harder. The room bent. Not structurally, the quality of reality in it. The warp pressed against the material world at every surface simultaneously, looking for the purchase point the sorcerer was trying to create, and finding it harder to access than his models had predicted. The cogitators in the outer ring began displaying output in a language not used since the dark age of technology. Kale and San went to one knee, hands pressed to their ears, not from pain, but from the pressure of reality being worked against its own grain. Even the lumen strips along the ceiling began flickering in a pattern that was not electrical failure, but something else, something that responded to the frequency of the warp push, the way iron responds to magnetism. Urgrak Bonebreaker stepped forward from the north wall. He crossed the space in 8 strides and hit Zerath's manifestation with the power claw. There was no announcement, no challenge, no orc war cry, just the warboss moving and the claw connecting with the form that occupied the sorcerer's anchor in the material realm, the physical substance that Zerath's presence required in order to operate with the precision he was operating with. The power claw crackled through the form with the specific violence of industrial force meeting warp anchor, and Zerath lost 3 seconds of focused concentration. 20 seconds, Ulven said. Zerath reconstituted. He looked at Urgrak Bonebreaker with an expression that was the nearest thing his face could produce to surprised. "You are protecting it," he said. "An orc warboss, defending a being he has no claim on. That is genuinely novel." "Shut up," Urgrak said, and hit him again. The knobs joined in. They were not achieving damage in any strategic sense. A warp entity of Zerath's tier did not fall to orc violence the way material opponents fell. But every forced reconstitution cost concentration, and the alignment he was attempting required concentration of a precision he had not expected to need to defend, while simultaneously fighting Aldrich's interference signal. The combined effect was not stopping him. It was making the final 30 seconds of bridge closure work cost 60 seconds of effort. He did not have 60 seconds. 15 seconds, Ulven said. The Hulk planted his feet. The floor cracked in concentric rings from the impact points. He took the warp pull that Zerath was focusing through the gamma field, the force of 800 years of patient architecture pressing toward its completion, and he held it the way you hold something that is trying to pull you off a cliff. Not with technique, with the single fact of deciding not to go. Then he pushed back, not away, through. He pushed the gamma output past the level the equipment had been built to handle, past the level Banner had calculated in any projections, past any ceiling the Hulk had previously established on this world or any other. And the reason he could push past those ceilings was the same reason he had always been able to, which was that the ceilings existed in other people's understanding of what he was, and not in what he actually was, and he had never been particularly bound by other people's understanding. The room went white, not light. The quality of everything in the room changed simultaneously, the air becoming a substance with different properties, the shadows becoming solid and the solid surfaces becoming momentarily uncertain, the entire material space of the processing center existing briefly in a state that was neither fully real nor fully not real. 3 of Ulven's remaining monitoring stations failed. The capacitor banks began failing in cascade, small explosions working from the outer ring inward, and Ulven was already compensating before the first one completed, rerouting everything that remained into a single focused output, the aperture formation. Everything else could break, the aperture had to form. Zerath made his final calculation. The gamma output was at a level his alignment attempt could not overcome in the time remaining. The orc mob had degraded his physical anchor, past the point where the microsecond precision of the bridge closure was achievable. Aldrich's interference had added another 20 seconds to the work. The branch had failed. The calculation was complete in less than 1 second, because Zerath had been running it in parallel with everything else, because he was Tzeentch's servant, and that was how they thought. He stepped back through the fold, not with haste, with the deliberate quality of a mind that has filed the experience and moved on to the next calculation. The fold sealed. The room's quality of reality normalized in stages, like pressure equalizing after a depth change, the lumen strips steadying, the cogitator outputs returning to something recognizable. The aperture formed. It was not dramatic. The air in front of the emitter array changed. The space became something that was no longer entirely here. Edges that bent light around them, a depth that went in the wrong direction, a quality of somewhere else pressing against the surface of somewhere that was. A door. The Hulk looked at it. Banner, inside the Hulk, looked at it. They looked at the same thing with the same eyes and felt the same weight, which was the weight of a departure before it had happened, the specific gravity of a thing ending before everything connected to it had resolved. Urgrak was at the edge of the cleared space, power claw still live, knobs arranged behind him. He looked at the Hulk across the wrecked apparatus, and the cracked floor, and the smoking remains of the capacitor banks. His expression had the quality of a man who has been given something rare and has not yet decided what to do with the rarity of it. The Hulk raised one enormous fist, not to strike, the other gesture, the one that needed no translation and had never needed translation in any universe. Urgrak raised the power claw in the same shape. The Hulk stepped through the aperture. The door did not close gently. It collapsed in a single implosive instant that sent a wave of displaced pressure through the room, lifting everyone who was not Urgrak or his knobs backward 2 steps, cracking the 2 cogitators that had survived everything else, and producing a sound that was every tuning fork in the universe struck simultaneously, and then struck again in a different key. Then the room was quiet. The air was air. The floor was cracked, and the emitter array was sparking in 17 places, and the lumen strips were steady, and Olven was already moving to assess the damage with the systematic focus of a Magos, who has learned that the work of rebuilding begins in the same moment the thing being rebuilt stops. No one said anything for 30 seconds. Urgrak looked at the place where the aperture had been. He looked at it for a long time with the expression of a man taking complete and careful inventory. Then he turned and walked toward the door, his knobs falling in behind him without a word, moving with the unhurried purposefulness of someone who has accomplished what he came for and does not require the accomplishment witnessed. At the door, he stopped. He did not turn around. "Good fight," he said. He walked out into the dawn of Solex Primaris, and the Forge world's brown-gray light received him, and the Warg that had grown enormous and strange in 4 days would begin to shrink in a week, would be manageable in 2, would be a memory in a month, and Urgrak Bonebreaker would carry the particular memory of a crater on a burning world, and the best fight he had found in 1,000 years, into every campaign that followed for the rest of a very long life. Han stood in the center of the ruined array. Her coat was ash-gray with residue. Her rosette had been displaced, and she straightened it with the deliberate, habitual gesture of a woman, returning herself to herself after an interval. Vesper was at her shoulder. Aldrich had opened his eyes and looked very tired and very calm. "Warp presence," Han said. "Gone," Aldrich said. The sorcerer withdrew when the aperture formed. "The gamma signal is also gone. The local aether is clear. What remains is standard Forge world background, and a Warg that will begin diminishing without its resonance source. 2 weeks, give or take." She walked to the place where the aperture had been, and stood there. The floor was cracked in concentric rings from the Hulk's weight during the final push. The scorch pattern of the gamma output radiated from the center in a shape that Olven would later spend 6 months analyzing without fully explaining. She thought about what Banner had said when asked if he was ready. No, then, yes. She thought about what it meant to carry something as large as the Hulk carried, something that was not separate from you, but was not simply you either, something that every power in every universe you had ever visited saw as a weapon or a wonder or a warning, and to spend your entire existence fighting not the enemies in front of you, but the fact that the thing they were all reaching for was made of you, and to hold against that, not because you were stronger than what was reaching, but because you had decided, somewhere below the level of decision, that you were not going to be taken, that the thing you were was the thing you were, not the thing someone else needed it to become. 800 years of patience, and a bridge built over 4 days of careful adjustment, and a sorcerer who had solved a problem in theory that he had not been able to solve in practice. Because practice required Banner to agree, and Banner had not agreed. She filed it. Under data. Under things worth knowing. Under the one category she had not expected to find new entries in after 30 years, which was beings who had held. In the dark of the warp, Zerath the Unwritten was not processing defeat. He was revising his model. The revision was precise. He had understood the Gamma being as a host carrying a force. He had reached for the force. He had found the force inseparable from the will that generated it in a way that was not host and passenger, not container and contained, not any conventional relationship his 7 centuries of chaos theology had prepared him for. They were the same thing in 2 registers, and will, when it was not separable from power, could not be redirected. It could only be broken, and breaking it had required more than he had brought to this specific moment. The architect noted the revision. In its unknowable way, the architect added the new data to structures Zerath could not see from his vantage in the middle of a hierarchy that ascended to something beyond any meaningful description of comprehension. Perhaps it filed the revision under data, perhaps under challenge, perhaps under a category that had no designation yet, because the most interesting things never did until someone created one. Zerath waited. He was very good at waiting. In a universe that was not this one, something arrived, not cleanly, not neatly. It arrived the way it always arrived, in the aftermath of something large, in the gap between moments, in a space that was exactly as broken as he had left it. The New Mexico laboratory, the device in pieces, the smell of ozone and scorched metal, and the specific quality of air that has recently held something that does not usually fit in rooms. Bruce Banner sat down on the floor of the laboratory and put his head in his hands and breathed. The gamma radiation in his body was steady, normal. The continuous low hum of a quantum-level mutation that had remade him and that he had been managing and being managed by for 23 years. The resonance that had been building in it for 4 days was gone. The bridge was gone. The watching presence was gone. He breathed. He put his hands flat on the floor of the laboratory and felt the specific reality of the world that had made him. Still broken in all the same ways, he was still what he was. Neither of these things was different from before. But something was different, in the way that something is always different when you have met something that could hold against you, and discovered that you could hold against it too. He sat on the floor for 3 minutes. Then he got up. He looked at what remained of the device. He began thinking about what Stark was going to say, and what he was going to say back, and what he was going to do next. And the next thing was the same as it had always been, which was, figure it out, keep going, hold on to the thing that was worth holding. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there was only war, a Forge world began rebuilding what it could rebuild and filed the rest under history. A WAG dispersed across a continent and then a subsector, seeking better fights in other places. An Inquisitor wrote a report that was precisely as accurate as it needed to be, and in the corridors of the Immaterium, a servant of the Architect of Fate revised his models with the patience of a being who had 8 centuries of practice and the absolute certainty that patience, in the end, was always rewarded with a new opportunity to ask better questions. The galaxy turned in its grim dark. The war continued, as it always had, as it always would. And somewhere in the long, unbroken chain of 10,000 years of conflict, a small correction had been filed, that there existed, in the infinite branching of the possible, a kind of will that could not be claimed, only met, only tested, and, in the end, only left alone to carry itself forward into whatever came next.